Millionaire humiliates his maid and fires her, but when he finds out who she really is, he's left in total shock. The sharp sound of high heels echoed across the polished marble floors of the Whitmore Hotel lobby, one of the city's most luxurious. Sunlight poured in through the massive glass windows, casting a golden glow that contrasted the cold modern architecture with the opulence of the golden details. In the middle of it all, there was James, standing tall, every bit the picture of undeniable authority at 45 years old. He moved past the staff with the same indifference he gave to the expensive artwork lining the walls, just another detail in his kingdom of luxury. "Sir, the weekend reservations are all confirmed," said Kate, his personal assistant, hurrying to keep up with his brisk pace. "And the head chef wants to discuss the new restaurant menu with you." Without even glancing at her, James replied, "I don't have time for that now. Just follow through with what was proposed and make sure it's flawless." His tone left no room for questions, and Kate knew better than to push back. Meanwhile, from a distance, Margaret Benson, a 70-year-old woman with gray hair tied back in a simple bun, watched the scene unfold. She remembered the days when the Whitmore was still a work in progress, and her younger self had the energy to keep up with it all. For 2 decades, she'd worked quietly, tending to the rooms as if they were her own home. But recently, her body had begun to fail her. Her hands trembled, and her tired eyes struggled to meet the hotel's high standards. As she hurried to tidy one of the luxury suites, a guest's sharp voice interrupted her. "This is a disaster," the woman shouted, a guest who demanded attention to every tiny detail. "The vase is crooked, and I found dust. How do you expect me to pay a fortune to stay in a place like this?" Before Margaret could respond, James appeared, drawn by the commotion. His cold eyes swept across the room, landing on Margaret holding a duster. He stepped toward her, posture stiff with disapproval. "Margaret, this is unacceptable," James said, his voice low but full of authority. "You've worked here for decades, and you still can't do your job properly? I don't pay staff to leave our guests dissatisfied." "I'm sorry," Margaret began, her frail voice breaking. "I was trying to fix things before you arrived, but—" As Margaret tried to defend herself, James cut her off mercilessly. "Excuses are unacceptable. I demand perfection, not justifications for incompetence." His eyes were cold and full of disdain, and with an irritated wave of his hand, he added, "Fix this immediately, or consider this your last day." Humiliation flushed Margaret's face, but she stood her ground, nodding silently. James then turned to the guest, his expression softening as if nothing had happened. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mrs. Hamilton. I assure you the service will be flawless from now on." "It better be, Mr. Whitmore. I'm a regular here, but my patience has its limits," the guest responded with a sly smile, fully aware of the power she held over the situation. Margaret watched as James exited the room, the guest following close behind, completely unaware of the wound he'd just opened in her heart. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, Margaret slowly walked down the empty hotel hallways, trying to erase the sting of the recent humiliation. But no matter how hard she tried, every word James had said echoed in her mind like a hammer, each blow deepening a silent pain. What would she do if she lost this job? As exhausting as it was, it kept her bills paid and a roof over her head. She sighed, pausing for a moment in front of a window, watching the city hustle far below. Inside James's office, the atmosphere was different. He was preparing for another meeting with international investors. There was always another deal, always one more opportunity. "Mr. Whitmore," Kate said, entering with a folder of documents. "The investors are ready for the conference, and the chef asked for a final review of the menu." James, clearly irritated, rubbed his temples. "I'm tired of these insignificant details, Kate. Let me focus on what actually matters now." I told him to handle it himself. Kate hesitated for a moment before nodding and leaving quietly. She knew that working for James was like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything could come crashing down. Outside, the hotel was buzzing with activity, staff rushing around, but Margaret, though she kept working, was miles away in her thoughts. Later that afternoon, as she polished the hallway on the second floor, the sharp ding of the elevator echoed through the corridor, signaling someone's arrival. As the doors opened and James stepped out, she stopped immediately. He strode forward, his usual look of disdain etched on his face, and before Margaret could utter a word, he began. "Margaret," his voice was cold as steel, "this has to stop." She looked at him, unsure of what he meant at first, but a sinking feeling took hold. "You can't do your job anymore," he continued, ignoring the inner turmoil building inside her. "This hotel needs precise, fast employees, and you clearly don't fit that anymore." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. She knew he was right about her limitations, but hearing it said aloud, in public and without a shred of compassion, crushed her. "Please, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice shaky, "I'm trying to do better. I just need a little more time." James cut her off sharply. "Margaret, I don't have time, and neither do you. What I have is a tarnished reputation, and I won't allow this hotel's name to be further stained by your incompetence." His words stung like blades. The other employees passing by glanced over but didn't dare intervene. The uncomfortable silence only made the situation heavier. Margaret knew it. This was the end. "Fired," he suddenly declared, without a hint of ceremony. "Pack your things and leave the hotel by the end of the day." Margaret stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what she'd just heard. "Fired?" she repeated, almost as if hoping he would correct himself. "Yes," James replied, unmoved. "If I were you, I'd leave with some dignity. Don't make this worse than it needs to be." Without another word, he turned and walked down the hall, leaving Margaret standing there alone. Her eyes welled up with tears as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. With every step James took, the weight of the dismissal pressed harder on Margaret's chest. She knew this was the end of her long journey at the hotel, but the blow was still too much to take in all at once. "He didn't have to be so cruel," murmured one of the younger maids who had witnessed the scene. "That's just how he is," an older employee responded, shaking her head. "And who can blame him? He owns it all. Who would dare to challenge James Whitmore?" Margaret, overhearing the whispers from afar, started walking again, this time heading toward the small closet where she kept her few belongings, her steps slow and her heart heavy. She knew this exit was different. It wasn't just the end of a job, it felt like the end of a part of her life. Walking through the city streets, the cold afternoon wind made her old bones ache, but she barely noticed the physical discomfort, lost in her thoughts. The small house she lived in, nestled in a modest neighborhood, felt farther away with every step. When she finally arrived, the silence that awaited her was just as crushing as James's harsh words. Before entering, she locked the door behind her and collapsed into the old armchair in the corner of the room. The worn walls, adorned with old photographs, bore witness to the hard years she had faced alone. And there, alone in her home, the tears she had held back all day finally came. Margaret wasn't just crying for the lost job, but for the humiliation, for feeling even smaller than she already felt. As time passed, her mind wandered through the past, searching for answers to the paths life had forced her to take. How had she ended up here? She had sacrificed so much, lost so much, especially her son. The thought of the baby she had once been forced to give up for adoption hit her like a punch in the stomach, and suddenly the emptiness she had tried to ignore for decades resurfaced. She stared at an old photo of herself taken when she was young and whispered, almost as if speaking to the image, "If I could turn back time, if I could just hold you in my arms again." The memory of that fateful day, so many years ago, never faded. Margaret had been young and without resources back then, a single woman with no family, looked down upon. With no options and living in poverty, she was forced to make the hardest decision of her life, to give her baby up for adoption, hoping he could have a better life than she ever could. The weight of that choice had never left her. Since the day she made the decision, it had haunted her, lingering in the back of her mind. And now, with the pain of being fired hitting her hard, that emptiness felt unbearable. Margaret stood up, her heart heavy, and walked over to a high shelf where she kept a small wooden box. Inside, there were only a few items, but each one carried deep sentimental value. The tiny hospital bracelet her baby had worn, a photo of the newborn, and the adoption papers. As she stared at them, the familiar questions filled her mind again. Who had her child become? Had he lived a good life? Was he loved? An idea began to form in her mind. A desire she hadn't felt in years stirred within her like a faint but growing flame. What if, she whispered to herself, holding the adoption papers in her hands, what if I tried to find him? What if I tried to learn what happened to him? That same night, Margaret picked up the phone and called Alice, an old friend who had some connections with lawyers. Alice, I'm sorry to call so late, but I need your help. I need to find out what happened to my child, the baby I gave up for adoption all those years ago. There was a pause on the other end. You still think about him? Alice asked, her voice filled with compassion. Every single day, Margaret replied, her voice shaky. I know it's hard. I know most of those records are sealed, but I have to try. I can't go on not knowing. I've already lost so much. Maybe this is my last chance to find some peace. Alice sighed softly but agreed. I'll make some calls. I'll try, but don't get your hopes up too much, okay? It's not going to be easy. Just knowing you'll try gives me a little hope, Margaret said before hanging up. For the first time in years, she felt a small spark of hope light up inside her. Illuminated in the midst of the darkness surrounding her, Margaret sat alone in her home, the heavy memories of a life filled with sacrifices weighing down on her shoulders. It felt as if every recollection was pulling her heart lower. But she clung to a tiny thread of hope. After all, who knows what fate had in store for her? At that moment, she had no idea how deeply her life was about to intertwine with the man who had just humiliated and professionally destroyed her. Then the phone rang, breaking the silence of that cold morning. Margaret, in her kitchen, moved slowly as she prepared her tea, still dressed in her worn wool sweater. When she heard the ringing, her heart raced and she dashed to answer it, almost hoping that this call would bring answers to her past. Hello? She said, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Margaret, it's me, Alice. I managed to talk to someone. We need to meet in person. I found some information, but it's a bit complicated. Can you meet me at the cafe near the square? Urgency dripped from Alice's voice. Yes, of course, Margaret replied without hesitation. That brief conversation was enough to make her heart race as she prepared. Thoughts whirled in her mind, each one faster than the last. Was it possible that after all this time, she was close to discovering her son's whereabouts? And what did Alice mean by complicated? The anticipation felt almost suffocating. On her way to the cafe, Margaret viewed the city through new eyes. Every unfamiliar face she passed could be linked to her past, perhaps a clue to what she was desperately searching for. Fear and hope mingled in her chest. When she arrived at the cafe, she saw Alice already seated at a discreet table in the corner, wearing a serious expression. Margaret sat down in front of her, silent, eagerly waiting for her friend to begin. Margaret. Alice started hesitantly. I found something in the adoption records. Your son was adopted by an influential family, the Whitmores. The mention of the name made Margaret freeze for a moment. Whitmore? She asked, feeling the weight of the name resonate like thunder in her mind. Yes, I checked several times. Your son was adopted by Richard and Eleanor Whitmore, a very wealthy family, and he was raised with everything money could provide. His name was changed to James Whitmore, Alice revealed. The name James Whitmore hit Margaret like a dagger to her heart. The pain she felt in that moment was deep and confusing. James Whitmore, the man who had humiliated her, the owner of the hotel empire she had devoted years of her life to, was the same baby she had lost so many years ago. The same man who had destroyed her livelihood was now revealed to be her long-lost son. Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the harsh reality before her. This can't be true, she murmured, shaking her head as if she could dispel the thought. I'm so sorry, Margaret, said Alice, leaning forward and gripping her hand tightly. But the evidence is all here. James is your biological son. He never knew he was adopted. But what am I supposed to do now? Margaret's voice trembled, struggling to come to terms with this new reality. He will never believe me. He hates me. Alice looked at Margaret with compassion. Maybe he doesn't know that yet. Margaret stumbled out of the cafe, her mind spinning as she wandered through the city streets aimlessly. The revelation that the son she had lost all these years was the very man who despised her the most was devastating. Yet deep inside, something began to stir. Maybe it was the love of a mother that had never faded. Or perhaps it was the longing to correct the mistakes of the past. That night, alone at home, Margaret sat down with the documents Alice had given her. The evidence lay right there, clear and undeniable. And there was one thing she could never forget: the birthmark her son had on his neck. It was an unusual crescent-shaped spot, a detail she always remembered. She had never seen that mark on James, but now everything was changing. Determined, Margaret knew the only way to confirm the truth was to see it with her own eyes. She would have to return to the hotel, find a way to glimpse that mark, and then, finally, confront James with the truth they had both lost for so long. With a heavy heart, but more determined than ever, Margaret prepared for what lay ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the desire to find the son she had lost outweighed any fear. The day was overcast when she decided to go back to the hotel. The tension inside her seemed to grow with every passing minute, yet her resolve to find the proof she needed was unshakable. Each step toward the Whitmore Hotel was a step closer to the truth. Even as fear tried to consume her, something deep down knew this was the moment. Margaret had to see the birthmark with her own eyes, the mark her son had carried since birth, just to confront James with the truth. She slipped into the hotel as if she were just another guest. No longer clad in the uniform she had worn for so many years, she still felt the weight of being in that place. As she walked through the hallways, each corner brought forth a bitter reminder of the years she had spent tending to every detail. Now, she felt invisible, just another shadow in the grand building. Meanwhile, James sat in his office, the panoramic view of the city behind the glass wall offering little comfort. His distant gaze revealed something was troubling him, a nagging discomfort he couldn't quite put into words, perhaps the burden of recent decisions weighing heavily on his mind. The pursuit of perfection kept him in a constant state of tension, or perhaps it was that vague reminder of Margaret. He had fired her without a second thought, yet her image lingered in his mind. There was something about her that intrigued him, but James knew the right moment to confront her hadn't come yet. He couldn't just walk into his office and spill the truth. James was a complex man. Any hasty move could ruin everything. At 5 o'clock, he would pass through the hotel lobby for a quick inspection. This was the time Margaret waited to see him. There he was, stepping out of his office with his upright posture and confident stride, heading down the stairs to the lobby. Margaret watched from a distance, her heart racing with every step. As he approached one of the mirrors in the hall, he paused briefly to adjust his tie. It was then that she spotted the small birthmark, discreet yet unmistakable. The crescent shape was right there, exactly as she remembered. There was no more doubt, her heart raced. With her mind filled with conflicting emotions, she cautiously approached him. What would she say? She couldn't wait any longer. When she got close enough, she called out to him with a fragile yet firm voice. "James." He turned, surprised to hear that familiar voice. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Margaret, and confusion washed over him. "What are you doing here? I thought you'd left." "Of course, I didn't want to say goodbye again." "But there's something you need to know," Margaret replied, her voice trembling but resolute. James frowned, clearly impatient. "I'm not interested in your excuses, Margaret. You don't work here anymore. That chapter is closed." "It's not about work," she said, taking a step forward. "It's something much bigger. Something you need to know about yourself." He stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or to throw her out. "I don't have time for games. What could be so important?" Margaret took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I'm not just your former employee, James. There's something that's been hidden from you, something your adoptive parents never told you." James straightened up, clearly uncomfortable with where this conversation was headed. "What are you talking about?" She stepped closer, locking her gaze with his. "I am your mother." The silence that followed was almost palpable. James stared at her, unable to comprehend her words, as if they made no sense. He blinked, confused, then let out a dry laugh. "This is ridiculous. You're insane." "I'm not lying," Margaret said, now with tears in her eyes. "I know this sounds impossible, but it's true. I was forced to give my son up for adoption many years ago, and you are that son. I can prove it." James shook his head, incredulous. "This doesn't make sense. I wasn't adopted. I'm the son of Richard and Eleanor Whitmore. I always have been. That's not true, Margaret insisted, her voice filled with pain. They hid this from you. But I have the documents, and the crescent-shaped birthmark on your neck is the same one you were born with. Suddenly, James put his hand to his neck as if he wanted to erase the mark she mentioned. For a moment, his expression wavered, but he quickly shook his head again. This is absurd. I know it's hard to believe, Margaret said, now calmer, trying to appeal to his humanity. But please, look at the documents. Just listen to me. James looked at her with a mix of anger and confusion. He was about to explode, but something inside him held him back. He wanted to shout that it was a lie, but at the same time, a small voice began to ask, "What if it's true?" Without saying another word, he took a step back, giving Margaret one last look before turning and walking back to his office, leaving her alone with silent tears streaming down her face. The confrontation had begun, but the truths were still far from being fully revealed. James slammed the office door shut, and the echo reverberated through the glass walls. James is panting like he just ran a marathon, but he's really just escaped the bombshell Margaret dropped on him. I'm your mother. His heart races, and his mind is a storm. His mom, trembling slightly, walks toward the table, leaning on it, trying to steady her breath. How can this be true? Anger and doubt take over, as everything he thought he knew about himself and his identity is questioned by a woman he barely knows. And that birthmark on his neck. He always knew it was unique, but he never considered it a sign of something much bigger. Sinking into the leather chair in his hotel room, he runs his hands through his hair, desperate for answers. He can't let Margaret's words eat him alive without uncovering the truth. In a swift move, he grabs his phone and dials his adoptive parents, Richard and Eleanor Whitmore, but the call goes straight to voicemail. Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Minutes drag on as he stares at the papers in front of him, but nothing makes sense. Then, finally, the phone rings. It's Eleanor. He answers quickly, her voice always so poised. James, what's wrong? You sound so anxious. And without missing a beat, he replies, Mom, I need to know the truth. I need you to tell me that I was adopted. A long pause followed, a silence that felt like an eternity. James could hear his mother's breath on the other end of the line. Finally, Eleanor spoke, but her voice was different, as if she had known this moment would come. James, why are you asking this? What made you think that? She tried to keep her voice steady, but he could feel her unease. Someone told me. Someone who claims to be my birth mother, he replied, his chest tightening. She says, I was given up for adoption years ago. I need to know if it's true. Did you lie to me? Eleanor took a deep breath. James could imagine the weight of the silence on the other end, the sad look she was probably exchanging with Richard. He waited, his heart racing as he felt the world beginning to crumble around him. James, dear, there's something we never wanted you to find out, she began, her voice almost a whisper. Yes, you were adopted, but we did it because we loved you so much and never wanted you to feel different or less special. You have always been our son, from the very first moment. The words hit James like a bucket of ice-cold water. He fell silent, processing the confession. Eleanor continued, as if desperately trying to explain. We wanted to tell you one day, but you grew up so happy, so confident, that we thought it would be better to leave the past behind. We love you, James, as if you were our own blood. James closed his eyes, feeling the tears welling up, but he made sure to remember how much he loved his parents. My adoptive parents and I always knew they raised me with love and care. But now, this truth feels like a scar that never existed because they never told me. James said, his voice dropping, filled with pain. You have a right to know, dear, and we're sorry. We thought we were doing what was best for you, Eleanor replied, her voice trembling. Who is this woman claiming to be your birth mother? What does she want? James hesitated, remembering Margaret from his hotel. Eleanor fell silent, and when she finally spoke, surprise filled her voice. Margaret, the woman who worked for you? This is incredible. James shook his head. He found it incredible too, but the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in a frightening way. The birthmark, his adoptive parents' reactions, what Margaret had said, everything pointed to a truth he never imagined. I don't know what to do, Mom, he said, sadness filling his heart. Before this, I treated her terribly. How can I believe? James, I know this is shocking, but you need to process it. Come visit us. We can talk calmly about it. Whatever the truth is, we will always be your family. He thanked her and hung up, but the weight of the moment left him frozen. He stood up and moved to the window, looking down at the city. What would he do now? Margaret had spoken the truth, but that didn't erase the cruelties he made her remember. He recalled the harsh words he had spoken, how he had dismissed her without considering her long history at the hotel. Regret began to swell within him, an uncomfortable feeling, but he knew he had to face the truth. He needed to listen to Margaret and maybe, for the first time, admit he was wrong. With a heavy heart, James knew the next conversation with Margaret would be the hardest part of his life. The next day, he woke with a void settling in his chest, the revelations from the night before still swirling like a storm in his mind. He spent the morning in silence, trying to absorb the truths he had uncovered, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake off the whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Margaret was no longer just a former servant, she was his birth mother. And somehow, that changed everything. By early afternoon, James made the decision he knew was inevitable. I really needed to meet with Margaret, but this time not as a boss, but as a son. Or at least as someone trying to understand what that means. My heart raced. I called Kate, my assistant, and asked her to set up a meeting with Margaret at the hotel cafe. It had to be away from the eyes of the other employees. I knew the conversation had to be private and that my office's formal setting wouldn't be right. When Margaret received the invitation, she felt a mix of relief and fear. Finally, James wanted to listen to her, but the confrontation she had dreaded for so long loomed deep within her soul. She prayed she could handle the truth without losing her emotional control. Over the years, she had built a wall to protect herself from pain, but now everything seemed to be crumbling. At 3 p.m., they were both sitting at a discreet table in the cafe. The tension was palpable. James, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, looked less composed than usual. There was something in his posture and fatigue that Margaret had never seen before. She, in turn, was quieter than usual, her fingers intertwined on the table, avoiding any eye contact. "Thank you for coming," James finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. He looked at her, trying to understand how this woman, so familiar yet so unknown, could be his mother. Margaret nodded, not quite sure how to respond. She knew he needed to speak first, that he was processing a truth that had been hidden for so long. "I talked to my adoptive parents," James began, his voice steady but marked by hesitation. "They confirmed everything. They confirmed that I was adopted and I saw the mark. The birthmark you mentioned." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. "So do you believe me now?" The question came out as a whisper, filled with pain and hope. James looked away for a moment, as if still battling internally. "I don't know how to process this, Margaret. Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie." He paused for a moment, trying to hold back the emotions threatening to spill over. "And I treated you horribly, humiliated you, and now I find out you're my mother." Margaret felt a tear silently slide down her face, but she didn't try to hide it. "I never wanted you to find out this way, James. I never wished for our reunion to be marked by pain and anger." She finally lifted her eyes to meet his directly. But he couldn't hold the gaze. "To know the truth, I waited for so many years." James swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. He understood that his biological mother had waited and suffered, and now all she asked for was understanding. But inside him was a barrier he just couldn't break through. It was hard to bring it down. It was hard to accept that all the humiliations and bitter words he had thrown at her now carried a completely different weight. "I don't know how to move forward," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "My whole life, everything I built was based on who I thought I was. Now, I don't know who I am." Margaret hesitated as she reached out and placed her hand on James's. "You are the same man you've always been, James. What's changed is what we know. You are my son. Even though I missed the best years of your life, we can still find a way to move forward." James stared at Margaret's hand resting on his, feeling emotions he couldn't fully grasp. "I was cruel to you, and now that I know the truth, I don't know how to fix what I did." You don't need to fix anything, Margaret replied, squeezing his hand gently. You were just being the man you thought you needed to be. I forgive you. There's no pain in my heart, only hope that we can find peace. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. James slowly withdrew his hand, as if processing what it meant to be forgiven. I need time, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. I need time to understand all this, but I want to try. I want to try to know you and understand who we are to each other. Margaret nodded, a sad smile on her face. I'll be here, James. I'll be here. He stood up shakily, and Margaret walked with him to the door. They said goodbye in silence, without hugs or grand gestures, but there was an invisible bond beginning to form. They both knew the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but for the first time, they were no longer so far apart. In the days that followed, a heavy silence hung in the air. James tried his best to focus on work, but something inside him had been shaken by Margaret's revelation. He stared at documents and meetings, but his mind kept drifting back to that conversation with the woman he had treated with indifference, unaware that she was his mother. Margaret fought against the anxiety of the unknown. She knew James needed time, but the fear that he might never accept her as a mother loomed like a constant shadow. With each thought of the future, her heart sank. Was it possible to build a relationship, or was it too late? Days later, James decided to take action. He knew he couldn't keep living as if nothing had happened. The only way to move forward was to confront what he felt and, more importantly, see Margaret again. He wanted a more neutral place, a small park near where he grew up. Margaret arrived right on time, as she always did. He found her sitting on a bench, gazing at a calm lake. The gentle breeze swayed the trees, creating a serene atmosphere. She approached slowly, her heart pounding. You came, James said, not taking his eyes off the lake. I came, Margaret replied, sitting down next to him. A tense silence settled between them, but it was no longer the discomfort of before. Something felt different, as if they were both ready to talk again. James sat in silence for a while, wrestling with his thoughts. I've thought a lot about everything you said, about who I am and what that means. I realized maybe I've shut myself off from a lot of things in my life. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. I don't know how to be your son. I don't know what to do with this. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. There's no formula, James. I don't know how to be your mother either. I never had the chance to learn, but we can try to figure it out together. James sighed, releasing the weight in his chest. I want to try. I want to understand who you are, who I am, but I also need to apologize. He lowered his head, his shoulders heavy with guilt. I was terrible to you. I treated you like you were nothing, and knowing who you are now tears me apart inside. Margaret felt tears welling up, but her voice remained steady. I've forgiven you, James. What matters now is what we do moving forward. He nodded, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something in her words that gave him hope, that he wasn't completely lost, and that there was still time to make things right. I've never been good at saying sorry, James admitted with a sad smile. I was always taught to be strong, but I realized that hasn't gotten me anywhere. I have money, power, but I don't have family. I have no one who truly knows me. Margaret replied softly, I've lost a lot too, James, but maybe now we can find something in each other. She looked into his eyes and saw something she had never noticed before. Love, the kind of unconditional love he had never truly understood. Try, huh? He asked, his voice wavering. I've always wanted to do that, Margaret said with a slight smile. All I've ever wanted was to have my son back. James gazed at the lake once more, but now there was something different within him. For the first time he felt he could lower his defenses, even just a little. So let's try, he finally said. But I need you to tell me what happened. Why you had to give me up for adoption. Margaret knew this moment would come. Though painful, she was ready to share the truth. I was very young, James, with no family and no money. Back then, being a single mother was looked down upon. I had no resources, and I didn't want you to suffer with me. I did what I thought was best for you. It was the hardest decision of my life, and not a day goes by that I don't think about you. James felt his heart sink as he heard this. And you never knew you had to do it? Where did you go? Margaret didn't answer. Her voice was heavy with sadness. "I only know that a wealthy family adopted you. I always prayed that you'd have a good life, that you'd be loved, and I'm happy that, in a way, you had all of that." James looked at her sincerely. "But I never really knew who you were. Now that I do, I want that to change." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "I want that too, James." A gentle breeze passed between them, almost as if nature was blessing that moment of reconciliation. There were no promises of a perfect future, but the opportunity they had was more than enough. With the patience of a mother, Margaret tried to reconnect with the son she never had the chance to raise. James began to see her as more than just the humble figure who worked at the hotel. During one of their meetings, he invited her to lunch in his penthouse, something he had never done before. "Sure." Margaret accepted nervously, her heart racing. She knew this was an important step. When she arrived, James greeted her with a smile that was more open than usual, something she was still getting used to. The room was impeccably decorated with modern furniture and art pieces that showcased James's refined taste. As she looked around, taking in the details of the luxurious home, he guided her to the table, where a carefully prepared lunch awaited them. Margaret expressed her gratitude for the hospitality, but couldn't shake off the distance that luxury still imposed between them. "I know it's strange having you here," James said, breaking the silence as he served the food. "I never thought I'd invite you to my home. I never imagined we'd have something like this." Margaret smiled gently. "It's not strange for me. I'm just happy to be here so we can finally talk like mother and son." James nodded, but there was something more. His face was heavy as they ate, lost in thought, as if something was bothering him. Margaret sensed this and decided to wait. She knew he had something on his mind. After a few minutes of light conversation, James stopped eating and looked at Margaret with a seriousness she hadn't seen since their first confrontation. "There's something I need to tell you, and I don't know how to start." Margaret put down her fork and looked at him intently. "You can talk to me, James. Whatever it is, I'm here to listen." He took a deep breath, running his hands over his face as if gathering courage. "I've been trying to change, Margaret. I've been trying to be different, but sometimes I wonder if you can really forgive me for everything I've done." "James," Margaret reached out and lightly touched his hand. "I've already forgiven you. What happened is in the past. We don't need to dwell on what happened. What matters is what we're building now." James took her hand, but his gaze was still heavy. "I understand, but it's hard to accept forgiveness. I was raised to believe that failure was unacceptable, and what I did was more than a failure. It was cruel. How can I live knowing I caused so much suffering to my own mother?" Margaret sighed, feeling the depth of James's pain. She understood his internal struggle, the weight of a remorse that was hard to overcome. "You're doing what you can now, and that's what matters. I know guilt weighs heavily on you, but guilt won't change what happened. All we can do is move forward, and if I can forgive you, you need to forgive yourself too." James fell silent, taking in her words. He knew she was right, but letting go of the guilt was harder than he had imagined. His life had been built around a rigid model of success and power, and now all of that seemed to crumble as his true story emerged. "I've made mistakes too," Margaret continued. "Giving you up was the hardest decision I've ever made in my life. You know, I've never stopped thinking about you, and regret has been my companion all these years," James started, his voice trembling slightly. "But life sometimes forces us to make decisions that hurt us." He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions. "We can't change what happened, but we can do better from now on." Margaret smiled gently. "You're strong enough to leave this behind, and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here." The connection between them grew, and the silence that enveloped them was filled with relief. It was as if the weight of guilt and regret was finally beginning to dissipate. For the first time, James allowed himself to believe that reconciliation was possible, not just with Margaret, but with himself. "Let's talk about lighter things," Margaret suggested, and they started sharing small moments from the past, laughing about the future. The afternoon passed quietly, without rush, with a silent promise that they were ready to rebuild something new and true. As Margaret prepared to leave, James walked her to the door. Before she stepped out, he embraced her. It was a shy and slightly awkward gesture, but it was filled with meaning. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," James said softly. "I would always give you a hug," Margaret replied, her eyes glistening with emotion and hope. In that moment, something changed between them. Forgiveness, although still a work in progress, began to take root. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy and that challenges still lay ahead. But that first step was all that mattered. Months passed since that silent hug, and both James and Margaret found a rhythm in their new relationship. It wasn't perfect, but the effort to create something real was evident in every meeting, every phone call, every effort to get to know each other better. James tried harder than ever to be different from the man he used to be. Margaret, in turn, was thrilled to finally have her son in her life, despite all those wasted years. Tonight is going to be special, James thought. He had invited Margaret to an important family gathering, something he wouldn't have done until recently. It would be a dinner at his house with his adoptive parents, Richard and Elor Whitmore. He knew this meeting could be a turning point in their relationship, but it was necessary for them to recognize and bring together the parts of their lives. James's story was about to change. Margaret arrived right on time, as always. When she stepped into James's house, he greeted her with a warm smile. For the first time, he seemed truly relaxed around her, which comforted her. "Are you ready?" James asked nervously as he led her to dinner. Margaret smiled, feeling a little nervous, but nodded. "Yes, I am. I think we all need this." Richard and Eleanor were already at the table, wearing friendly expressions but showing slight tension. They knew how much this meant to James and hoped everything would go well. As soon as Eleanor saw her, she extended her hand. "I'm so glad you came," she said with a sincere smile. "James has told us so much about you." Margaret shook Eleanor's hand and felt the tension easing. "Thank you for inviting me. I know this isn't easy for anyone." They all sat down, chatting about trivial things, the weather, the news, updates about James and his parents. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the real reason for the gathering still hadn't been addressed. After a while, Richard cleared his throat and looked directly at Margaret. "I just wanted to say that we're eternally grateful you brought James into the world. He is our son, and always will be. Now we understand the sacrifice and pain you went through." Margaret smiled, touched by Richard's words. With tears in her eyes, Margaret said, "Thank you, Richard. I always knew James was in good hands, and I'm grateful for all the love you've given him." James silently watched the scene, feeling a peace in his heart. The reunion of the two maternal figures in his life was a moment of closure and a new beginning all at once. It wasn't easy for him to handle so many conflicting emotions, but for the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything without hiding behind his old facade of arrogance and control. When dinner wrapped up, the air was filled with a sense of relief and acceptance. As Margaret stepped out of the house, she sensed that this was a new chapter, not just for James, but for all of them. Weeks later, James took the necessary step and headed to Margaret's small house, where she was waiting for him in the living room, surprised by his unexpected visit. "James, what a surprise to see you here without any notice," Margaret said, smiling as she looked around. "What did you need?" James, with a serious but calm expression, sat beside her and replied, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened." Margaret nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I've realized that we can't change the past. As much as I wish I could, I'll never recover the years you lost being my mother. But what we can do is start anew." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of joy. "I'd love that, James." Then he pulled out a small key from his pocket and handed it to her. "I bought you a house, a better house, in a more comfortable place. I don't want you to worry about anything. I want you to live comfortably as you deserve." Margaret looked at the key, surprised and overwhelmed with emotion. "James, I don't need this." "I know you don't," James interrupted with a smile. "But I want to give this to you not as a debt, but as a gift from a son who wants to care for the mother he has rediscovered." Now in tears, Margaret held the key and gazed at him with a heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, James. You didn't have to do this. Just having you back is the greatest gift I could receive." James stood up and hugged her tightly, this time without hesitation. I promise we won't waste any more time. We'll make this work. With that embrace, a cycle closed. The arrogant millionaire who once humiliated the woman he now knew was his mother had finally found what he had been missing most in his life: a true family connection. The path to forgiveness and reconciliation hadn't been easy, but with love and patience, mother and son managed to find a new beginning. And for James, nothing mattered more than finally having a family to share his life with. Did you enjoy today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.